If attraction were enough to make a man commit, you wouldn't be watching this video. The real reason men pull away has nothing to do with chemistry, communication, or effort, and most relationship advice accidentally makes it worse. By the end of this video, you'll understand the one internal switch in a man that determines whether attraction stays temporary or turns into deep, self-driven commitment. If you've ever found yourself thinking, things were going so well, and then something shifted, or he says he cares, but it doesn't feel secure, or why does it feel like I'm doing more and getting less? I want you to know something before we go any further. There is nothing wrong with you. And more importantly, this isn't happening because you're asking for too much, moving too fast, or messing it up. In fact, what you're experiencing is extremely common among intelligent, emotionally aware women who genuinely want a deep, committed relationship. What's confusing and exhausting is that most of the advice you've probably followed was supposed to prevent this exact outcome. You communicated clearly, you were supportive, you tried to be understanding, you gave space when you thought it was needed, and you leaned in when it felt right. And yet, here you are, still wondering what he really feels, still unsure where you stand, still feeling that quiet anxiety that comes from emotional uncertainty. And the hardest part? You don't even know what changed. Here's the truth. No one explains clearly. Attraction alone does not create commitment, and effort alone does not make a man feel emotionally bonded. That doesn't mean attraction isn't important, and it doesn't mean effort is wrong. But there is a missing variable, one that determines whether attraction stays surface level or transforms into something solid, self-driven, and emotionally secure. Most relationship advice never talks about this variable, not because it's malicious, but because it's largely invisible, especially from a woman's point of view. Let me explain what I mean. You can have chemistry with a man, you can laugh together, you can connect emotionally, you can even hear him say the words, "I care about you," or "I love you," and still feel like you're walking on emotional eggshells, like his interest fluctuates, like he's not fully anchored, like if you pull back, everything might fall apart. That disconnect, the gap between what looks like closeness and what feels like security, is where most women get stuck. And when they get stuck, they do what any caring, intelligent person would do. They try harder. They explain more clearly. They give more grace. They offer more reassurance. They become more accommodating. Not because they're weak, but because they're invested. And ironically, that's often when things start to deteriorate. Here's where the confusion deepens. You'll hear advice like, just communicate your needs. Don't overthink it. Give him space. Or, be independent. Don't be needy. Don't chase. Show him you're valuable. And on the surface, none of this sounds wrong. But when you try to apply it in real life, it often feels contradictory. Because one day, being open feels right, and the next day, it seems to push him away. One moment, giving space works. The next, it creates distance. So you start monitoring yourself. Am I texting too much? Am I being too distant? Did I say the wrong thing? Should I have handled that differently? And before you realize it, you're no longer present in the relationship. You're managing it. Let me say something gently, but clearly. A relationship that requires constant self-monitoring is not emotionally safe. And a man who truly feels bonded does not need to be managed. That's the first clue that something deeper is at play. What makes this especially painful is that many women internalize the situation. They start to wonder, maybe I'm too emotional. Maybe I want too much. Maybe I'm not enough to make him choose me. But here's what I want you to consider instead. What if the problem isn't how much you care, but how male commitment actually forms? What if the issue isn't attraction, but what attraction does, or doesn't, turn into inside a man over time? What if there's a specific internal process that determines whether a man begins to emotionally invest or keeps one foot out the door. Because here's the part that most women are never told. Men don't fall into commitment the same way women do. That doesn't mean men don't love deeply. They absolutely do. But the pathway is different. And when you don't understand that pathway, it's easy to unknowingly interrupt it. Especially when you're acting from love, fear, or desire to protect the relationship. That's why this happens to women of all ages. Women in their 20s, women in their 40s, women who've been married for decades, women in long-distance relationships, women who did everything right, different situations, same emotional outcome, uncertainty. What makes this even more frustrating is that from the outside, everything can look fine. He still texts, he still shows up, he still says the right things. But inside, you feel it. That subtle distance, that lack of emotional momentum, that sense that you're more invested than he is. And because you can't see what's happening internally for him, you're left guessing. Guessing is exhausting. Guessing is where anxiety lives. And guessing is not how secure relationships are built. Now here's the important shift I want to make with you. Instead of asking, what should I do differently? A better question is, what internal condition causes a man to move from attraction, which isn't enough to keep him from pulling away, into commitment that comes naturally and without conscious effort on his part? Because once you understand that, everything else starts to make sense. Why behaviors you believe will draw him closer actually backfire. Why effort doesn't always pay off. Why reassurance seeking creates distance. Why some men become deeply devoted without being pushed. Something we'll be covering more deeply later on in this video. And finally, why others remain emotionally vague no matter how much you give. This isn't about games. It's not about manipulation. And it's not about pretending to be someone you're not. It's about understanding how commitment is triggered internally and how it's accidentally shut down even when you're following so-called expert relationship advice. In this video, I'm going to walk you through that process step by step, not with vague advice, not with cliches, but with a clear explanation of what's actually happening beneath the surface, so you can finally stop guessing. And once you see it, you won't be able to unsee it. You'll start recognizing patterns. You'll understand why past relationships unfolded the way they did. And you'll see exactly what creates emotional security without chasing, convincing, or over-functioning. Before we go deeper, I want to be clear about something. This isn't a promise of instant results. And it's not a, say these words and he'll commit tomorrow kind of thing. Anyone who tells you that is selling fantasy. What I'm offering you instead is clarity. The kind that removes self-blame, replaces anxiety with understanding, and allows a partner's commitment to become self-driven, not forced. In the next part of this video, I want to show you why so much well-meaning relationship advice unintentionally works against this process, and why trying harder often makes things worse instead of better. And later, I'll explain how women use a structured framework to stop guessing entirely, so they can feel calm, grounded, and confident in where they stand. For now, all you need to do is keep listening, because once you understand what's really happening here, you'll realize this was never about your worth. It was about missing information. At this point, most women do something very reasonable. They start looking for better advice. If what they've been doing isn't working, the natural assumption is, I must be missing the right approach. So they read more, they watch more videos, they talk to friends, they search for frameworks, and on the surface, the advice sounds smart, often even empowering. But here's what almost no one stops to ask. What model of male commitment is this advice actually based on? Because advice is only as good as the model underneath it, and most relationship advice, even well-meaning, intelligent advice, is built on models that don't reflect how men actually form emotional bonds. Let's walk through a few of the most common ones, not to shame them, but to understand why they fail so predictably. Let's start with the advice almost every woman hears first. especially when she's confused or feeling uncertain. You're told to just communicate your needs. This is probably the most common advice of all. And in theory, it makes sense. Healthy relationships require communication. Honesty matters. Needs shouldn't be bottled up. But here's what this advice quietly assumes: that emotional clarity creates emotional safety. For women, that's often true. But for men, emotional clarity does not automatically translate into emotional bonding. In fact, when communication becomes the primary tool for trying to secure commitment, it often produces the opposite effect. Why? Because men don't bond through verbal processing in the same way women do. So when communication is used to resolve uncertainty, rather than express connection, it can feel like pressure, even when it's calm, respectful, and loving. The man may not consciously think, "She's pressuring me," but internally, something registers as, "I'm being evaluated," and evaluation shuts down emotional momentum. Another popular explanation sounds more psychological, almost clinical. You're told this is about attachment styles. Attachment theory can be incredibly useful when it's applied correctly. But here's how it's often used instead. He's avoidant. I'm anxious. That's just our dynamic. And suddenly, the relationship becomes a diagnosis. The problem with this approach is subtle but important. Labels describe patterns. They don't explain mechanisms. So instead of understanding what activates or deactivates bonding, the focus shifts to managing symptoms. You start accommodating his avoidance. You start suppressing your anxiety. You start negotiating around the dynamic. But accommodation does not create commitment, and self-suppression does not create security. Without understanding what actually pulls a man inward emotionally, attachment labels become a way of tolerating uncertainty, not resolving it. Then there's the advice that swings in the opposite direction. Don't be too available, play it cool, pull back. This advice has been around forever, and sometimes it works, at least temporarily. Why? Because scarcity can increase attention. But attention is not the same as emotional investment. Playing hard to get often creates short-term pursuit, heightened curiosity, increased texting, temporary intensity. But it rarely produces long-term devotion. Why? Because it relies on withholding, not bonding. Eventually, one of two things happens. He wins and loses interest, or he disengages because the dynamic never stabilizes. This model mistakes chasing for choosing, and those are very different psychological experiences. Chasing can increase attention, which can easily fade or die out completely. But choosing is what increases commitment. Some advice sounds empowering on the surface. You're told to be completely independent and not need him at all. This advice is often framed as empowerment, and independence is healthy. But here's where this model goes wrong. It assumes that emotional self-sufficiency automatically creates attraction and commitment. What it often creates instead is emotional ambiguity. A man may admire you, respect you, even feel attracted to you. But admiration does not equal emotional attachment. If a man never experiences himself as meaningfully involved in your emotional world, his investment remains optional. He enjoys you, but doesn't anchor to you. And from the outside, it looks like, he likes me, but he won't fully commit. Other advice is quieter, but just as common. Be patient, be easy, don't ask for too much. This model comes from fear. Fear of being too much, fear of driving him away, fear of asking for what you want. So women adapt. They become easygoing. They minimize their needs. They give more than they receive. They tell themselves, if I'm patient enough, he'll realize what he has. But here's the painful truth. People don't emotionally invest in what doesn't require them to invest. When there's no emotional friction, no sense of contribution, and no role to play, investment stalls. This doesn't make him a bad person. It just means the relationship never gives him a reason to move forward internally. And finally, there's the idea that physical connection will eventually lead to commitment. If the chemistry is strong enough, the rest will follow. This one is rarely said out loud, but it's often implied that if the physical connection is strong enough, emotional commitment will follow. Sometimes it does, often it doesn't. Because physical intimacy creates closeness, not anchoring. And when intimacy isn't paired with emotional meaning, it can actually delay commitment by making the relationship feel complete enough without it. This is why so many women say, "It feels like we're together, but not really." Now, here's the important thing to understand. None of these models are bad. They all contain partial truths. But partial truths are dangerous when you're relying on them for emotional security. Because when they fail, you don't just lose a strategy, you start losing confidence in yourself. And this is where many women quietly turn inward. They think, maybe I need to heal more. Maybe I'm attracting the wrong men. Maybe commitment just isn't realistic. But look at what's really happening. All of these models focus on what you do, how you communicate, how you behave, how you present yourself. None of them explain what happens inside a man that causes commitment to deepen. So women are left managing behaviors without understanding the internal process that actually drives outcomes. Here's the reframe that changes everything. Men don't commit because things are easy. They commit because something inside them becomes engaged. Something internal shifts. And once that shift happens, effort becomes self-driven. Not because you asked, not because you waited, not because you performed perfectly, but because something fundamental turned on inside of him. In the next part of this video, I want to show you what that internal switch actually is, not as a theory, not as a tactic, but as a psychological reality that explains why these models fail and what works instead. And when you see it, you'll finally understand why commitment has always felt unpredictable, even when attraction wasn't. Now that you can see why these approaches fail, we can finally talk about what actually makes the difference, because there is an internal switch that determines whether attraction deepens or stalls. Up to this point, we've talked about what doesn't work. Now it's time to talk about what actually does. Because once you understand this next part, everything you've experienced, every confusing relationship, every sudden shift will start to make sense. There is an internal switch inside a man that determines whether attraction remains temporary or transforms into something deeper, more stable, and self-driven. This switch isn't conscious. It's not something he sits down and decides. And it's not something you can talk him into. It's something that activates inside his identity. And it's known as what many people call the hero instinct. Now, before you react to that phrase, I want to be very clear about what this is and what it is not. This has nothing to do with ego stroking. It's not about flattering him, acting helpless, or making yourself smaller so he can feel bigger. In fact, when people misunderstand this concept, they often apply it in ways that completely backfire. So let's strip this down to its psychological core. At the most basic level, the hero instinct is a man's deep internal drive to experience himself as useful, effective, and meaningfully contributing, especially in the emotional world of the woman he's involved with. Not controlling, not superior, not dominant, but needed in a way that feels earned. This isn't something society taught men. It shows up across cultures, across ages, and across relationship styles, because it's tied to identity, not personality. Here's the key distinction most advice never makes. A man does not emotionally bond because he feels admired. He bonds because he feels engaged. Engaged in a way that allows him to express who he is through action, effort, and contribution. When that happens, his emotional investment grows automatically. When it doesn't, attraction floats, but never anchors. Let me put this in simple terms. Men fall in love through doing, not through processing. That doesn't mean men don't have emotions, they do, but the way those emotions deepen is different. A woman often bonds through emotional sharing, verbal connection, feeling understood, and feeling safe to express. A man bonds when his actions matter, his effort has impact, his presence changes something, and his contribution is felt. When those conditions exist, something subtle but powerful happens. He starts to see the relationship as part of who he is, not just something he enjoys. This is why a man can feel attracted to you, enjoy your company, and care about you, and still not feel compelled to commit, because attraction doesn't automatically engage this internal drive. Enjoyment doesn't activate identity, and emotional closeness alone doesn't always create investment. Here's where this becomes incredibly important. When the hero instinct is activated, commitment doesn't feel like pressure to a man, it feels like alignment, like stepping into something that already feels right. That's why men often struggle to explain why they suddenly want to commit. They'll say things like, "I just knew," or "It felt different with her," or "Something clicked." They're not being mysterious. They simply don't have language for an internal process that wasn't conscious. Now let's contrast this with what most women are taught. Women are often taught that giving more builds closeness, being understanding builds trust, and making things easier builds security. And again, none of that is wrong, but here's the catch. When a relationship becomes too frictionless for a man emotionally, there's nothing for him to step into, no role to play, no sense of contribution, no internal momentum, so the relationship stays pleasant, but passive, and passivity is the enemy of commitment. This is why you'll hear women say things like, "I supported him through everything," or "I made his life easier," or "I was always there for him," and yet, he drifted, not because he didn't care, but because his internal drive never fully engaged. Let me give you a simple example. Imagine two scenarios. In the first, a man is dating a woman who handles everything herself. She's capable, independent, and doesn't ask for much. He likes her, he respects her, but his role is optional. In the second scenario, he's dating a woman who is also capable, but who allows him to contribute in ways that matter emotionally, not by playing helpless, not by asking him to fix everything, but by allowing his presence, insight, and effort to mean something. In that second scenario, he begins to feel connected through action. His identity becomes involved. And once identity is involved, walking away feels different, because distance no longer feels like relief. This is the part that changes how you see everything. Men don't protect what they merely enjoy. They protect what they invest in. And investment isn't just time or money. It's emotional effort. Now, this instinct doesn't turn on all at once. It activates gradually, through patterns, small moments, and subtle signals where his contribution lands emotionally. And once those patterns repeat, commitment stops being a question. It becomes a direction. This also explains something that confuses many women. Why some men suddenly become deeply devoted without being asked. They start checking in more, making plans, prioritizing time, talking about the future, and feeling protective without being controlling. And when asked why, they often can't articulate it. They just know they don't want to lose her. Now here's the most important thing I want you to hear. This instinct is not activated by neediness, and it's not activated by self-sacrifice. In fact, those behaviors often shut it down, because they remove the man's role and replace it with emotional caretaking. The hero instinct activates when your emotional world has space for his contribution. His effort creates impact, and his presence changes how you feel, not because you're dependent, but because you're receptive. That distinction is everything. When women misunderstand this, they often swing to extremes. Either they overfunction and carry the emotional load, or they shut down and become emotionally unavailable. Neither extreme creates commitment. Commitment lives in the middle, where contribution is possible. This is why so much advice feels like it works, until it doesn't. It may spark attraction, it may increase attention, it may create closeness. But if it doesn't engage this internal drive, the relationship stalls at a certain depth, and from the outside it looks like he likes me, but he won't fully choose me. Now, here's where this becomes empowering instead of frustrating. Once you understand that commitment is driven by internal engagement, not external persuasion, you stop chasing. You stop over-explaining. You stop trying to manage outcomes. Why? Because you realize something important. You don't create commitment by convincing a man. You create the conditions where commitment becomes his idea. In the next part of this video, I want to show you something critical. Not just what this internal switch is, but how it gets accidentally turned off, especially by women who are loving, capable, and emotionally intelligent. Because once you see that, you'll understand why trying harder has never worked, and how small, unintentional patterns quietly shut down the very thing you want most. Now that you understand what actually drives commitment inside a man, there's a question that naturally comes next. If this internal switch is so important, and if it explains so much, why does it seem to turn off so often, especially in relationships where the woman is loving, supportive, emotionally aware, and genuinely invested? This is the part where many women feel a wave of emotion. Because once you see this, you realize something difficult, but also incredibly freeing. You weren't doing the wrong things. You were doing the right things at the wrong moment, in the wrong emotional role. Let's start with something subtle. Most women are taught, explicitly or implicitly, that love means taking care of the relationship. So when something feels uncertain, they step in, they clarify, they smooth things over, they offer reassurance, they hold emotional space. Again, this comes from love. But here's what happens internally for a man when this becomes the dominant pattern. The emotional responsibility quietly shifts. Instead of feeling like a contributor, he begins to feel like a recipient. And when that happens too often, his internal drive to invest starts to disengage. Not dramatically, not consciously, but gradually. This usually starts in a very subtle way, especially for women who are emotionally intelligent and caring. You begin doing more of the emotional work without realizing you've taken it on. This is one of the most common and invisible patterns. Overfunctioning doesn't mean being clingy or dramatic. It often looks like anticipating his needs, managing emotional tone, avoiding conflict for harmony, and fixing misunderstandings before he even feels them. From the outside, this looks mature and loving, but internally, something important changes. There's no longer a gap for him to step into emotionally. So his sense of contribution weakens. And when contribution weakens, his motivation to commit weakens with it. Another pattern shows up when you're trying to be understood. You explain what you're feeling, hoping clarity will create closeness. Many women believe that if they just explain clearly enough, the man will understand and respond. Sometimes he does, but understanding is not the same as bonding. When emotions are over-processed verbally, men often feel talked at, not connected with, especially if the conversation is aimed at reducing uncertainty. Internally, this can register as, "I'm being evaluated," or "I'm being asked to reassure." And reassurance seeking, even when gentle, creates pressure. Pressure doesn't activate commitment, it suppresses it. This one is especially easy to miss, because it sounds reasonable. You're not asking for commitment. You're just asking for clarity. Reassurance seeking doesn't always sound like, "Do you like me?" or "Where is this going?" Often it sounds like, "I just want to know we're on the same page," or "I'm not asking for commitment, I just need clarity." These are reasonable desires. But when clarity is requested before his internal engagement has matured, it creates emotional resistance, not because he's selfish, but because something inside him hasn't fully activated yet. and being asked to declare something before he feels it creates friction. That friction quietly shuts down the internal drive that leads to natural commitment. Sometimes this pattern comes from empathy. You start regulating the emotional space so he doesn't have to. Emotional caretaking often looks like regulating his moods, absorbing his stress, being endlessly patient, or carrying emotional weight so he doesn't have to. This one is especially tricky because it often looks like love. But when caretaking becomes the foundation of the relationship, something flips. He stops feeling like a source of emotional strength and starts feeling like a dependent. That dynamic doesn't inspire commitment. It quietly erodes polarity. Over time, some women find themselves quietly steering the relationship. They set the tone, the pace, and the emotional direction. Many women end up here without realizing it. They initiate the conversations, define the tone, set the pace, and decide when things need to be addressed. Again, this is often done out of maturity, but leadership and investment are not the same thing. When a man doesn't feel emotionally activated, he lets the woman lead. And when he lets the woman lead long enough, commitment stalls. Because internally, it no longer feels like his journey. This pattern often shows up after disappointment. Instead of waiting to be chosen, you start trying to outperform. Some women shift into comparison mode. They try to be more attractive, more interesting, more accommodating, or more impressive. But commitment doesn't come from winning. It comes from choosing. And when a man never experiences the emotional weight of choosing you, his internal decision never solidifies. And this is where many women end up without realizing it. They believe security will arrive if they're patient enough. Many women believe that if they're loving enough, understanding enough, and enduring enough, security will eventually arrive. But security is not earned through endurance. It's created when emotional investment flows toward you, not away from you. When you're the one holding the relationship together, security never arrives. Now I want to pause here and say something very important. None of these patterns make you weak. They make you human. They come from love, fear of loss, and wanting to build something real. Almost every woman falls into them, especially when she cares. The problem isn't you. The problem is that these patterns quietly turn off the very internal switch that creates commitment. Here's the shift that changes everything. Commitment doesn't grow when you remove all emotional friction. It grows when there is just enough space for a man to step into his role. Not a forced role, not a scripted role, but a role that allows him to experience himself as emotionally significant. When these patterns dominate, he may still care about you, enjoy your company, feel attraction, and miss you when you're gone. But something crucial never fully engages, and that's why things stay ambiguous. Now here's the part that creates urgency, but not fear. These patterns don't just stall commitment. Over time, they train him to be passive. And passivity doesn't reverse itself on its own. It requires a shift in dynamic, not effort. If you're listening and recognizing yourself in these patterns, hear this clearly. Nothing is broken, nothing is ruined, but something does need to change. Not who you are, not your values, but the way emotional responsibility is distributed. In the next part of this video, I'm going to show you what happens when this internal switch is allowed to turn on. What changes in his behavior, what shifts in the dynamic, why effort becomes self-driven, and why commitment starts to feel calm instead of fragile. And at that point, you'll finally understand why devotion, emotional security, and even obsession aren't mysterious. They're predictable. If this is already describing your situation very clearly, that makes sense. By the end of this video, I'm going to walk you through the framework women use to reverse these patterns, without playing games or suppressing who they are. For now, just keep listening. Now that you understand what shuts this internal switch down, the next question becomes obvious. What happens when it's allowed to turn on? Because this is where most women feel a mixture of hope and skepticism. They think, okay, but what does that actually look like? So let's talk about it. Clearly and realistically, not fantasy, not fireworks, but the real, observable shifts that happen when a man becomes emotionally engaged at the identity level. The first thing that changes is initiative. When the internal switch is off, initiative feels uneven. You're the one checking in, starting conversations, clarifying plans, and sustaining momentum. But when the switch is on, something flips. He begins to initiate, not out of obligation, but because it feels natural. He texts because he wants to. He plans because it feels satisfying. He follows through because his effort now carries meaning. And this isn't dramatic. It's subtle, consistent, and unmistakable. The second shift is emotional presence. Before, you may have felt like he was there but not fully there. Distracted, inconsistent, emotionally intermittent. When the switch is on, presence deepens. He listens differently. He remembers small details. He responds instead of reacting. He becomes curious about your inner world, not because he's trying to impress you, but because your emotional experience now feels relevant to his identity. The third shift is protective investment. This is often misunderstood. Protection doesn't mean control, and it doesn't mean jealousy. It shows up as wanting to be reliable, caring how his actions affect you, and adjusting behavior without being asked. He begins to feel responsible for the emotional tone of the relationship. This is one of the clearest signs that commitment is forming. Because protection only emerges when something feels valuable and personal. Now let's talk about something women notice immediately. When the switch is on, other women fade. Not because you asked for exclusivity, not because you competed, not because he promised anything. They fade because his attention has anchored, and once attention anchors emotionally, it doesn't scatter easily. This is why obsession often feels unexplainable from the outside. But from the inside, it's not obsession at all. It's focus. Another major shift is future orientation. Before, the future may have felt vague, plans felt tentative, conversations stayed in the present. When the switch is on, future thinking happens spontaneously. He references things months away. He includes you in his mental map. He imagines life with you, not as pressure, but as possibility. And importantly, you don't have to ask for this. Now here's something critical. When the internal switch is on, commitment doesn't feel fragile. You don't feel like one wrong move will ruin everything, because you're no longer carrying the emotional weight alone. Effort is shared. Responsibility is shared. Investment flows both ways. This is what emotional security actually feels like. Not perfection, but stability. Let me say something important here. This shift does not require you to become less intelligent, less capable, or less emotionally aware. In fact, women who experience this shift are often the same women who were previously over-functioning. The difference isn't who they are. It's how the emotional dynamic is structured. Now let's address something that comes up often. Women worry. If I stop doing all the work, won't the relationship fall apart? Here's the paradox. If the relationship only survives because you are holding it together, it was never stable to begin with. When the switch is on, the relationship doesn't require maintenance. It has momentum. This is why testimonials often sound dramatic. Women say things like, I didn't change him. He changed. I didn't ask. He just stepped up. I stopped worrying, and suddenly everything shifted. These aren't miracles. They're the result of an internal mechanism engaging. Here's another subtle but powerful change. When the switch is on, conflict changes. Arguments don't disappear, but they no longer feel threatening Because he's emotionally invested, he doesn't withdraw at the first sign of tension. He wants resolution, not escape, and that alone changes the tone of everything. Now let's talk about timing. This shift doesn't always happen instantly. Sometimes it unfolds gradually. But once it starts, it doesn't reverse easily, unless the dynamic slips back into pressure or overfunctioning. That's why understanding this mechanism matters. It allows you to protect the dynamic instead of unknowingly undermining it. Another thing women often notice is calm, not excitement, not adrenaline, calm. That quiet sense of, I don't need to chase this, and calm is not boredom. Calm is what security feels like when attraction is already present. Now here's the most important thing I want you to understand. This isn't about making a man obsessed with you. It's about creating the conditions where he becomes emotionally invested in the relationship itself. And when that happens, devotion is a byproduct, not a goal. At this point, many women start asking a different question. Not, how do I get him to commit? But, how do I make sure I don't turn this off again? And that's the right question. Because once you understand this mechanism, guessing is no longer necessary. What you need is structure. In the next part of this video, I'm going to lay out the two paths most women face once they reach this realization. One path leads back into trial and error. The other leads to clarity, confidence, and emotional security without suppressing who you are. And once you see the difference, the decision becomes simple. At this point in the video, most women arrive at a quiet realization. Not panic, not urgency, just clarity. They think something like, okay, now I finally understand what's been happening. And when that understanding lands, there are really only two paths forward. Neither one is wrong, but they lead to very different emotional experiences. The first path is trial and error. This is the path most women take, often without realizing it's a choice. You keep doing what you've been doing. You rely on intuition, adjust as you go, read signals, guess, and hope you're interpreting things correctly. Sometimes things improve, sometimes they don't. And when they don't, you ask yourself, did I pull back too much? Did I lean in too soon? Should I have handled that differently? This path isn't foolish, it's human, but it's also exhausting. Because trial and error requires emotional energy, over and over again. And when you care deeply, the cost of guessing gets higher each time. On this path, you may still get moments of closeness, moments of connection, moments where things feel promising. But there's always that underlying uncertainty, that sense that if you relax too much, things might slip. So you stay alert, and staying alert is not the same as feeling secure. Now here's the part most women don't realize until much later. Trial and error doesn't just drain you. It also keeps the relationship in a fragile state. Because when you're constantly adjusting, correcting, and compensating, the emotional load quietly stays on your side. And that makes commitment harder, not easier. The second path is pattern-based clarity. This path begins with a different assumption. Instead of asking, what should I do next? You ask, what pattern am I in, and what pattern creates commitment? This path doesn't rely on guessing. It relies on understanding. Understanding when to step back, when to allow space, when to stop over-functioning, and when not to explain. And when to let emotional momentum build on its own, not because you're playing games, but because you understand how commitment actually forms. On this path, you don't become less caring. You become less anxious. You stop trying to manage outcomes. You stop carrying the relationship emotionally. You stop wondering whether you're doing it right, because you can see what's happening. And when you can see patterns, you don't panic inside them. Now let me be very clear. This path does not guarantee that every man will commit. No framework can do that. But what it does guarantee is this. You stop wasting emotional energy on dynamics that can't deepen. You stop blaming yourself for things that were never in your control. and you stop staying in relationships where commitment never truly engages. That alone is life-changing. Here's something most women don't hear often enough. The goal isn't to make a man choose you at any cost. The goal is to create conditions where commitment becomes possible, effort becomes self-driven, and clarity replaces confusion. And if a man still doesn't step into that, you'll know without guessing, and knowing is peace. This is why structure matters so much. Not structure as rules, but structure as protection. Protection from overgiving, over-explaining, over-functioning, and losing yourself trying to hold something together. When you understand the patterns, you don't need constant reassurance. You trust what you see. Now, if you're listening to this and thinking, I don't want to keep guessing anymore, that makes sense, and you don't have to. Because once you understand the internal switch and the patterns that activate it, there is a way to move forward with clarity instead of hope alone. That's what we're going to talk about next. Not as pressure, not as hype, but as an option. In the next part of this video, I'm going to show you what a structured framework for this actually looks like. How it helps women stop overthinking, how it protects emotional momentum, and how it allows commitment to become something a man steps into on his own. Then you can decide, calmly and clearly, whether that's something you want. At this point, you understand something most people never fully articulate. Commitment doesn't happen because you say the right thing, and it doesn't happen because you try harder. It happens when a very specific internal process is allowed to unfold without being interrupted. And once you see that, the question isn't, does this work? The question becomes, how do I protect this dynamic once I recognize it? Because understanding a pattern intellectually is one thing. Living inside it, especially when emotions are involved, is something else entirely. This is where structure matters. Not rigid rules, not scripts you memorize, not pretending to be someone you're not, but a framework that helps you recognize what stage you're in, understand what not to do, and stay grounded when emotions rise. It helps you avoid self-sabotage when you care, and it allows commitment to become self-driven. That's exactly what his secret obsession was created for. Now, I want to be very clear about what this is and what it isn't. His secret obsession is not a collection of tricks, it's not manipulation, and it's not about controlling a man's behavior. It's a pattern recognition system, a way of understanding how men emotionally attach, how that attachment deepens, and how it quietly shuts down, so you don't accidentally work against yourself. The reason this works so consistently is because it doesn't try to change men. It works with what's already there. The framework helps you see when the hero instinct is beginning to activate. It helps you avoid the patterns that turn it off. It helps you understand what kind of emotional space allows investment to grow. And it helps you respond in ways that feel natural, not forced. This is why women often say, I didn't feel like I was doing anything dramatic. Or, I just stopped second-guessing myself. Or, things started shifting on their own. Inside the program, you're not just told what the internal switch is. You're shown how it shows up in real conversations, how it appears in texting, and how it plays out in early dating. You're shown how it changes in long-term relationships, and how to recognize when emotional momentum is building or stalling. So instead of wondering, what does this mean? You know, one of the most valuable aspects of this framework is that it protects you emotionally. Because when you care, your instincts often push you to over-explain, over-give, over-correct, and over-function. Not because you're weak, but because you're invested. Structure acts like a buffer. It keeps you from reacting in ways that feel right in the moment, but undermine the dynamic long-term. Now let's talk about something important. This framework is not just for new relationships or dating apps. It's used by women rebuilding trust after distance. Women in long-term relationships that feel stagnant. Women who are married but emotionally disconnected. Women navigating on and off dynamics. Women unsure whether commitment is coming or fading. Because the internal switch doesn't disappear once commitment happens. It still governs emotional investment over time. Another reason this framework is so effective is because it gives you language for things you already feel. You stop doubting your instincts. You stop wondering whether you're reading too much into things. You start trusting what you observe without spiraling, and that calm changes everything. Now, I want to address something directly. Some women worry, if I use a framework, won't it feel inauthentic? Here's the truth. Reacting from anxiety is not authenticity. Suppressing yourself to keep a man is not authenticity. Authenticity isn't about blurting out every feeling in the moment. It's about aligning your actions with what you actually want long term. This framework doesn't change who you are. It removes confusion so you can be more yourself. Inside his secret obsession, the content is organized so you're never overwhelmed. You don't need to study everything at once. You simply recognize your situation, apply the relevant guidance, and let the dynamic unfold naturally. That's why women often say it feels like having clarity instead of rules. If you're the kind of woman who has tried to figure it out on your own, if you're tired of wondering whether you're doing too much or too little, if you want commitment to feel calm instead of fragile, then this framework was designed for you. At this point, there's nothing for you to decide emotionally. You already understand the mechanism. This is simply about whether you want structure instead of guessing. If you do, you can access his secret obsession using the link in the description of this video. Take your time. Read through what's included. See if it resonates. There's no pressure. In the final part of this video, I want to address a few common concerns that come up for women at this stage. Questions about age, past mistakes, and whether it's too late. Then I'll leave you with a grounded way to move forward, whether you choose the framework or not. Before we finish, I want to slow things down for a moment. Because if you've stayed with this video to the end, you're probably not impulsive. You're thoughtful. You reflect before you decide. And you've likely been hurt or disappointed before. So instead of pushing you to act, I want to address a few of the quiet questions that tend to surface right now, especially for women who care deeply. The first one is this: what if I'm too old for this to matter? This comes up more often than you might expect. Women wonder if there's a window they've missed, if patterns are already set, if men at this stage of life don't change. Here's the truth. This internal switch isn't age-dependent. It's not about youth, novelty, or starting over. It's about how emotional investment forms, and that process doesn't expire. In fact, many men become more responsive to it as they get older, because they're more aware of what stability and connection actually mean to them. The second concern often raised is this: what if he's avoidant? This question usually comes from pain, because avoidant behavior feels confusing and personal. But here's what's important to understand. Avoidance isn't the absence of desire. It's the absence of internal engagement. When the internal switch never fully activates, avoidance becomes a protective strategy. That doesn't mean every avoidant man will commit, but it does mean this framework explains why avoidance shows up and when it softens. And just as importantly, it helps you recognize when a dynamic can deepen and when it can't without guessing. The third concern is the belief that you've already messed this up. This one carries a lot of emotional weight. Women worry they've said too much, given too much, or crossed some invisible line. But here's something reassuring. Most relationships don't fail because of a single moment. They drift because of patterns. And patterns can change, not by fixing the past, but by shifting the dynamic going forward. Understanding what turns the internal switch off allows you to stop repeating those patterns, and that alone often creates space for something new to emerge. The fourth concern is about manipulation. This is an important question and a healthy one. Manipulation is about overriding someone's autonomy. This framework does the opposite. It removes pressure. It removes persuasion. It removes control. It allows a man to choose without being pushed. And it allows you to stop contorting yourself to earn security. That's not manipulation. That's alignment. Finally, there's the question of choice. What if I decide not to use the framework? That's completely okay. You don't lose anything by understanding how this works. In fact, even without structure, you'll start seeing things differently. You'll notice when you're over-functioning, when you're carrying emotional weight, when investment is one-sided, and when commitment isn't building. And awareness alone creates change. Here's what I want you to take with you. Regardless of what you decide, you were never asking for too much. You were asking in a world that didn't explain how commitment actually forms. You weren't failing, you were missing a map. If you choose to use the framework, it's there to support you, not replace your intuition. If you don't, you now have clarity that most people never gain. Either way, you no longer have to guess, and that's powerful. If you'd like to explore his secret obsession, you can do that calmly, in your own time, using the link in the description of this video. No pressure, no urgency, just information. And whatever you choose, remember this. Real commitment doesn't come from chasing, it doesn't come from proving, and it doesn't come from fear. It comes from alignment, from emotional engagement, from a dynamic that allows two people to step forward, freely. Thank you for staying with me through this, and wherever you go from here, I hope you move forward with clarity, confidence, and peace.